I definitely am excited to present and help moderate this panel, the International Repatriation Success between the Karl Museum in Radebeul, Germany, and the Sault Ste. Marie tribe of Chippewa Indians located in Sault Ste. Marie, or Bawating, like we like to call it, the place of the rapids in northern Michigan. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Robin Leopold with the Karl Museum, and he's going to start us out.
Yeah, thank you again, Colleen. I'm pleased to speak again at this year's Repatriation conference. And I speak here also in the last panel. So hopefully it's okay when I say now some things from my last speak. As I'm unable to attend the full panel, you have to know here it is 8:30 p.m. and our children have to go to bed after them. So maybe I have to go quickly after my presentation. Yeah, Colin Madison asked me to make a few remarks again about the start of the repatriation reclaim and the background of our work together from our perspective. So I apologize if there are some repetitives from my presentation in the previous level. I have also made some remarks on the background and history of our museum in the previous panel, so I will not go into this part again. When the Sault Ste. Marie tribe's request to repatriate a scalp reached the museum in 2014, it was a learning process for the museum staff at the time. Until then, historical scalp trophies had been exhibited in the museum in order to address the historical context of the war culture in North America on the one hand, and on the other hand, to illustrate the brutality of the European colonial powers' actions against the indigenous population. Today, scalps are no longer displayed in our museum. The request from the Sault Ste. Marie tribe of Chippewa Indians generated awareness among the entire museum staff and a debate about the handling of human remains in our museum. Nevertheless, the request for the return of one of the scalps meant a difficult decision for the museum and ultimately the responsible persons in the Kalmai Foundation as the owner of the museum. The reclaimed scalp represents an important aspect of the Kalmai Museum's history. It came from Patty Frank original collection. Patty Frank was a circus artist and also a private collector. And this collection he had assembled before selling it to Clara Mai in 1926. There's no information about the provenience of most of the pieces in Patty Frank's original collection. All we know is this Patty Frank corresponded, bought and traded with various museums, dealers, and collectors in Germany, England, USA, Switzerland, and in other parts of the world. We have only a very few information of the most pieces of Patty Frank's collection. The scalp is one of the few objects of Patty Frank about which he published an origin story. According to the story, it was his first collected scalp trophy. He made the decision to collect scalps when he saw Buffalo Bill Cody in his Wild West show with his captured scalp of Cheyenne Yellowhair. According to Patty Frank's story, he had bought his first scalp from a Dakota named Swift Hawk for $100 and 3 bottles of alcohol during a 1904 engagement in the United States. This scalp seemed so important to Patty Frank that it even became the museum's official logo in the 1930s. Patty Frank was considered a great storyteller who never really told where he got his collected objects. So whether the story is true or not cannot be determined. The Sault Ste. Marie tribe's reclamation was ultimately based primarily on a statement in a caption to the scalp, which had already been pictured in a publication in the 1920s. A piece of information was noted that is not found in the published history of Patty Frank. Thus, the Dakota Swift Hawk had captured the scalp from an Ojibwe. In the museum's inventory, however, the scalp was inventoried with the affiliation Dakota. And so I start my little presentation. Okay, so here you can see the historical inventory card of the scalp item. In the museum, there was the desire to invite representatives of the Sault Ste. Marie tribe to a direct conversation in 2014. But this could only be realized with the support of the city of Radebeul, because the museum and the foundation lacked their own financial resources for this. And the representatives of the tribe, the foundation, and the city met then on the occasion of the Karl May Festival in 2014, which is the Karl May Festival is organized annually by the city of Radebeul. The result of these first discussions in 2014, in which Cecil Pavlat and Colleen participated on the part
Hey,
of
Robin.
Yeah.
I'm so sorry to interrupt you. I'm wondering if we can move to the next slide so as to not show the remains again.
Okay. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you so much.
Yeah. The result of these first discussions, in which Cecil Pavlat and Colleen participated on the part of the Sault Ste. Marie tribe, was a letter of understanding to establish a joint research plan to clarify the origin of the scalp. So this is one picture of the signing of the letter of understanding with Cecil Pavlat and the former director of the Karl May Museum, Claudia Kaulfuß. Collaborative research included object analysis on the age, style, and regional origin of the scalp, archival research on the background of Patty Frank's narrative, as well as information from Ojibwe oral history and oral tradition. And third, biographical research on the person Swift-Hawk as the seller of the scalp. In addition, a hair morphological report was prepared for the scalp by the Saxony State Office of Criminal Investigation to prove its human origin. The result of this examination, in which the object was not damaged, but only the hair structure was closely examined under the microscope, showed that it is with very high probability human hair, which is at least 150 years old and probably comes from the North American region. Regarding further research, the Sault Ste. Marie tribe and the foundation commissioned two outside experts in the field of Ojibwe and Sioux material culture to evaluate the scalp in their style. Likewise, the tribe submitted findings on the Swift-Hawk person. Thus, there was a person of that name at the Buffalo Bills Wild West Show who died in France in 1819. However, at the same time, the tribe found that Swift-Hawk was a common traditional Lakota family name that remained in use until. Thus, it is ultimately difficult to clarify which Swift-Hawk is meant in Patty Frank's story. Also regarding the veracity of Patty Frank's narrative, all that could be found was that there was no evidence of Patty Frank being in North America in 1904. There's only documentation that he was employed with a group of artists on a US tour of the Barnum and Bailey Circus in 1910. It is more likely that the scalp, like many other objects in the Patty Frank collection, was acquired through one of Patty Frank's many dealer contacts. As a result of the research, both parties, foundation and tribe, determined that exact tribal attribution of the scalp could not be clearly established. However, the Sault Ste. Marie tribe continued to desire to bring the scalp as a Native American ancestor back home for burial. This was also advocated in a resolution at the National Congress of American Indians in 2015. However, a final decision was delayed for another 3 years. In the meantime, there have been several personal changes in the museum staff and also in the Karl May Foundation. So in the last 4 years alone, we have had 3 different directors. In 2018, the Karl May Museum got a new museum director, and for the first time, someone with a professional museum background. He made contact with the US State Department and asked them to mediate in this case. So the talks between us and the tribe start again. The US State Department representative worked out a proposed solution. and both parties committed to follow this proposal. So the mediator's proposal was sent out last year in May. The mediators suggested that the Sault Ste. Marie tribe's request for respectful burial of the ancestral remain be granted and to give the ancestral remain in return for that. However, the proposal of the mediator came at a time when not only everything was disrupted by the corona pandemic and the museum was closed for several months, but also our director, who had come in 2018 and has resigned at this moment. We were left without leadership and direction during this time and the following weeks, as the board of the Karl May Foundation had also dissolved. It took until the fall of 2020 before the structures were restored. After that, we could finally deal with the proposal of the mediator. In the end, the newly elected board of the foundation, of the Karl May Foundation, voted united in favor of the mediator's proposal and the transfer of the scalp for a dignified burial. However, the board of trustees also had to give its approval. And this was the big problem lay. It took many decisions and discussions before, after long meetings, the board of trustees in our foundation agreed to allow the transfer. After the decision to hand over the ancestral remain, another problem was to when the ancestral remain could be officially handed over and how this item as a human remain could be taken out of the country according to the German regulations of burial law. The transfer of the scalp could ultimately only be carried out with the support of the US Embassy, the US Consulate General in Leipzig, and the Foreign Office of the Federal Republic of Germany. For this purpose, the Karl May Foundation had to decide to officially hand over the human remain to the representative of the US Department of State, and the US Embassy then ensured that this human remain could be transferred to the US through diplomatic channels. The United States government, represented by the US Department of State, also agreed to receive the item as bailee on behalf of the Sault Ste. Marie tribe of Chippewa Indians. The corona pandemic then prevented several attempts for the official handover. Also, it was not possible to invite representatives of the tribe. So the handover finally took place on April the 12th this year. And here this is a picture of the signing of the handover papers. It would like to conclude my remarks by referring once again to the day, April the 12th this year. It was certainly one of the most important and significant days in the history of the Karl May Foundation and our museum. After years of discussion with the foundation and with the petitioners for a return, the Sault Ste. Marie tribe of Chippewa Indians, the foundation's governing bodies, board of directors, and our council of elders finally agreed to hand over the item as an ancestral remain of North American Indigenous people for a dignified burial in its homeland. This is the first ever release of an object from the foundation's museum's collection. From the foundation side, there were many concerns beforehand. Is it a loss? Are we giving away a piece of the Karl May heritage? Will our museum soon be empty? These are fears of the foundation's council of elders. Many people sit in this council who once were active in the museum and who therefore have a special connection to it. We from the museum, who have always advocated in all this time to go new ways and also in this case to come to a good agreement for all involved, but especially for this ancestor remain, advertised that the handover of the indigenous ancestor for a burial is above all chance to open new doors and build bridges. Completely in the sense of Karl May, who also wanted to set a monument to the indigenous cultures with his fictional stories more than 100 years ago, and who had always stood up for peace and above for the understanding of the peoples in the world. The foundation is still committed to these ideals today, and we had to make them aware of them again in this case. Just because the human remain item is no longer part of the museum's collection, its story is not lost for us. It can still be told in the museum, be part of the exhibition, and perhaps even sensitize our visitors for the handling of human remains and the rights of indigenous people to return them for a dignified burial in their homeland. So For us at the museum, especially for me as the head of the collection, who is the only who deals with the objects daily, it was important that the farewell and the journey of the ancestral remain be done in a dignified way. The Sault Ste. Mary tribe asked the cultural attaché at the US Embassy in Berlin, David Mees, if it would be possible to place the ancestral remain in a box made of cedar. They also asked that the scalp be wrapped in red cloth and, if possible, that sweetgrass and sage be added. The US Embassy was willing to have the cedar box made, and it was also natural for us to comply with these requests to provide red cloth, sage, and sweetgrass. I made some points in the previous panels about the hobby clubs that were formed around the Karl May Museum and during the GDR times made sure that Indigenous representatives continued to visit and interact with our museum. Various people from this hobby scene heard about our decision to return the human remain to the USA for burial. They understood and welcomed this decision, seeing it as a contribution to righting the many wrongs that Native American peoples had suffered over the centuries. Perhaps the representatives of the Sault Ste. Mary tribe were surprised to see that the ancestral remain was not only wrapped in red cloth, as promised, but also wrapped in a piece of rawhide. It was a wish of a person from this scene who gave it to me for the ancestral remain to really start its journey back home well and safely protected. Sage and sweetgrass were also gifts from our museum's garden, where we also grow these plants for a few years. For us, and especially for me, these gestures were very important. They were an appreciation, and I could not only wish the ancestor remain a good and safe journey home, but also thank him for being with us in the hope that he was always treated with dignity here. The day of the handover was attended by the Saxon Minister of Culture, the Mayor of the City of Radebeul, the Chairman of the Board of the Foundation, as well as the representation of the Foreign Office of the Federal Republic of Germany, and last but not least, the new Consul General of the USA in Leipzig, Ken Toko, and David Mees, Cultural Attaché of the US Embassy in Berlin. As I already revealed in the last panel towards the end, it was certainly not an easy decision in the Karl May Foundation. It was a very hard emotional process for us as well. Nevertheless, I think we did the right thing for the ancestor remain, and I hope that he has found his peace and rest. The small Karl May Museum, a tiny organization compared to the big ethnological cultural institutions in Germany, has taken a step that still not many museums in Germany do. It was hard, but also instructive for us. Ultimately, I see in this the positive for the future, to open doors in the spirit of Karl May and to build bridges to the indigenous people, for whom there is a great interest here in Germany. If and when in the future the Karl May Foundation will take further such step, I cannot say, but I hope so. It should be important in all future cases that both sides always meet with respect and that first gets to know each other and especially tries to understand and respect the feelings of the other side. Then we will be able to build more such bridges. Therefore, we would be happy if we could stay in contact, especially with the Sault Ste. Mary tribe in the future, and maybe realize projects together. We invited them to present their culture and their concerns here in Radebeul. Thank you for your attention again.
Great, Robin. We definitely appreciate that. If you want to take your screen share down. I thought I heard you say that you might be heading out early. Is that right?
Yeah.
Would you, I mean, I wonder if then, if we're able, if anyone has any questions for Robin, if they could ask them now, and then that way, instead of waiting till the end, so that the audience has an opportunity to have a moment to ask some questions. And while we're waiting for questions, I kind of have a question, and I know that I might be coming from a very biased point of view in this question, but first off, I wanted to say, I think it's very brave of you to be here on behalf of the Karl May and talking with us today. And I know that it's almost like you're in the hot seat, and in a lot of ways you are. But I've heard your presentation now twice, and well, I really appreciate the gestures and the gifts, the parting gifts that you gave with our ancestor, as I'm sure Cecil and Marie also feel the same way. But it's kind of clear to me that, it's still, you're still working in the context of a colonial institution with colonial collection practices and an old guard, board of overseers and board of directors. And it almost feels like, it's almost like the institution still doesn't get it. and I'm having a hard time, kind of saying that out into words, but I understand that it was emotional on your behalf, being part of the process from the beginning to the end, Robin. But in your presentation, you didn't acknowledge, the emotional burden that we were carrying as well for our ancestor. And I'm really feeling like the foundation doesn't have any plans for future repatriation, according to some of the answers you gave at the previous panel. And so I kind of want to circle back to that and talk about it. What's preventing further repatriations, because we understand and know that there are more partial human remains ancestors in your collection. And I'm just really feeling like I need to ask that. What's the future plans there?
Yeah. Yes, to tell the truth is the foundation has yeah. Has decided to the foundation has decided not to release any more objects at the moment. So, and this is the thing. I'm not the responsible for this, and I'm not the person who say the decisions there. This is the
Well, I like I said, I know what position you're sitting in right now, and I certainly appreciate the truth, and that's always the best way to go, right? So I appreciate.
I can only offer for the goals, and also for the manners of indigenous people, and also for the rights. But this is very, very difficult and very, very hard and stony way. And I think at the Karl Foundation, it needs time when the old guys are gone.
When they're not there anymore.
Yeah.
I'll say it. Well, if there's any questions for Robin, please put them in the Q&A. And it looks like we do have one raised hand, so I'll bring Shell in. And just for everyone listening, and this is by no means me wanting to just put Robin on the spot, but I do want to give the audience a chance to have a time for Q&A, so that when he leaves early from the presentation, that those questions were answered beforehand. So I'm going to bring Shell on. Shell, you're with us now. Go ahead.
Robin, I just wanted to bring up the point. I was very connected and I felt very kind when I brought up the issue before about the use of the term scalp and using images. And I felt like I was being very kind in doing that. It bothers me, and I'm going to communicate this to you, because you actually said, a big part of this is listening to people and hearing other people's points of view. And even when Shannon and I made it very clear that that was not appropriate, you continued to use the phraseology and you continued to use the images. And so I just need to let you know I'm not okay with that. And it just needs to be said. That's all I need to say. Thank you.
Thank you, Shell. I don't see any other questions. But by all means, if any of our panelists have any questions for Robin before he heads out or anything, now would be a good time. Otherwise, I will move to our next speaker. I'm always honored and excited to introduce my good friend and my teacher, someone who's been a role model in my life, and someone that I love very much, Cecil Pavlat. He's an Anishinaabemowin language instructor for the Sault Ste. Marie tribe of Chippewa Indians and the former cultural repatriation specialist for over 13 years. He's who taught me about caring for the ancestors and how to do this work. And so I owe a great deal of gratitude towards him, although I'm not buttering up for any reason right now, although he probably thinks I am. And so I'll turn it over to Cecil, and Cecil is going to talk to us from the very beginning of the request to repatriate this ancestor from the Karl May. Cecil was the cultural repatriation specialist at the time. I was the cultural repatriation assistant. So I was studying underneath him, working with him when this all started. And so I'd like to turn it over to Cecil, and he's going to talk really about the tribal perspective and what happened on our end, and the things that we went through as the tribe requesting repatriation. So Cecil, the floor is yours, but you're on mute.
Anin, Bojo, Giglangwasa, Nin, Ojibwe Minoa Jagana, Shiendao, Ji Jokendo Dem, Bao Ting and Don Jaba, Minoa, Bao Ting and Dada, Sault Ste. Marie tribe of Chippewa Indians and Do de Benda Gus. Greetings, everyone. My name is Cecil Pavlat. I am Crane Clan from Baoting, sometimes called Sault Ste. Marie. So I also still live here, and I am a member of Sault Ste. Marie tribe of Chippewa Indians. I'm a little bit disturbed, I guess. I would use a different word, but to see the picture posted and the reference to our ancestral remains as the word that Robin used. And I understand that's the scientific term, I guess. Museum people may use that, but it still doesn't make it acceptable. So with that said, I'll get on with sharing a little bit. Again, repatriation, it can be very difficult and contentious. And really, I had a sense of deja vu when we went to Germany and spoke with the people there and listened to their concerns and, of course, voiced ours as well. And one of the things that I remember back in 90s, late 90s, there was this unfounded fear by museums and other institutions that held our ancestors and our sacred objects hostage. You know, they had this unfounded fear that if they were to return anything, that then they would have to return it all. This is not true, and obviously in the United States now you can see that as being 20 years prior to this repatriation effort with Karl May. And so that unfounded fear has reared its head again, and I can somewhat understand that. And it wasn't really a total surprise, but it still doesn't make it right. During Robin's presentation there, he mentioned the fact that there was no proof that this ancestral remains were Ojibwe or whatever tribe that Patty Frank chose to use the terminology of Ojibwe, though. And so it always upsets me that when someone quotes a story and then says that there's no proof that that story is true. And it always falls upon tribes to prove that, whether it's through the NAGPRA law here in the U.S. or anywhere else. And so, that's frustrating, to say that we are not believed in what we express and how we need to feel and need to accept these things that have happened to us as a people, these atrocities, these grave robberies, these efforts to minimize us as a people, but I always go back to what I understand. And what I understand is that we are very resilient. Very resilient. We are still here because of that resiliency. And another thing I'd like to point out is that we are very patient. We've been suffering these things for 400 years, and yet we are still here. We still work to work and honor and do what we have to do, our responsibilities, our obligations to our relatives, to bring them home. We have to do that. We understand that, and we will do that. And although it appears Karl May has made a decision not to repatriate anything else, and he called the ancestral remains an object at that point. And I think that was probably a mistake. So I'll give him the benefit of the doubt on that one. But I have to disagree. I think you will repatriate. We will do whatever it takes for however long it takes to bring our ancestors home and to culturally appropriately and respectfully return them to the womb of our Mother Earth. This is how I believe. This is a belief that I have faith in. And so, again, it may take years, as this took 8. And there's been repatriation efforts that I can remember that took 20. We're not going to give up. We will not do that. We will continue our efforts, and we will bring our ancestors home. So one of the things that, we talk about, difficulties in how things are expressed and how things are understood. And one of the things that struck me the most when I went to Germany with Colleen, and then again later by myself, there was this kind of lost in translation feeling where them as Germans really didn't understand what we were saying. And we as Americans didn't understand, the context of what they were saying. So there was a real dysfunctionality to communication with them. And I can see why. I still to this day, when I speak with others, that the way they form their sentences, the way they think about things differently than us. We think about them on a spiritual and emotional basis of remembering our ancestors and what they have done for us through the many, many, many generations. And so these difficulties that we faced, initially there was a lot of stonewalling. I have to say, I think sometimes we were told things that weren't necessarily, I felt, sincere. We were kind of told what we wanted to hear, and but we did not give up. Again, we show that patience, we show that kindness until we're pushed to the point where it's time to react differently and to approach things differently. But that is a last resort. I've always been taught that our people, they have these teachings, and 2 of them that I call grandmother teachings are teachings of living your life through kindness and generosity. I have always felt that when I was around my elders. And all my relatives on my mother's side were all fluent. And so I heard that language spoke. I seen the practices done, maybe a little bit different than they were done 200 years, but the idea behind them, you know, those respectful burials, those ceremonies that are done, they're done with a clean mind and a good heart. And so I still practice those things that have been ingrained in me by our grandmothers, our aunties, and all the women that are so important to us as Anishinaabe people. So maybe it will take time, I'm sure. But I can tell you, we will not give up until we repatriate all of our ancestors, whether that's when I'm alive or when I'm gone to that spirit world, and whoever else it is picks this up, it will happen. I believe that. I have faith in that. And so I will continue to be kind and generous until I am moved to be something else. So again, I appreciate the combined efforts of the State Department. And of course, I'm going to forget some names here. And the German consulate, the U.S. Embassy in Germany. There were so many people that played a role, you know, and to make this come true for us as a people. And so I don't want to forget people, so I'm not going to name too many names, but I see David Mees is here with us, the gentleman, my friend. That brought our ancestor home. He did so in the most kind and loving way. You could feel his sincerity, and I appreciate that, and I'm thankful, grateful. But I know there are more to speak, and so I'd like to say miigwech kinagoya bizinduik. Abama pikwaban minwa misawa. So turn it over to my colleague and friend Marie Richards. Miigwech.
Thank you, Cecil. If I could just also give Maria my best introduction through my tears, because I am crying like a baby over here. Miigwech, Cecil, for those beautiful words. I can't thank you enough. And I want to introduce Marie Richards. Marie is the current repatriation and historic preservation specialist at the Sault Ste. Marie tribe of Chippewa Indians. And so first it was Cecil, then me, and now it's Marie. So we're all here to talk about our different perspectives with the Karl May repatriation. And of course, Marie played such an important role at the end of the outcome with the repatriation. And we're so thankful for all that you provided, Marie. And so also, Marie is a PhD candidate in I think it's a cultural heritage program. So shout out to the work that you're doing there. And with that, I'll turn it over to you. You have the floor now, Marie.
Miigwech, Colleen. Anin Buju, Gijibaba Sekwe Nadejnakas, Ishpaming, Michigan, Donjaba, Miknik Dodam. So I'm Marie Richards. I'm joining you all from Bawating. I'm Turtle Clan. Was born right here in Michigan and got to travel around, and here I am back in Michigan. Where to start? So I started in this position a year ago, more than a year ago now, and after being mostly in an academic archaeological background of joining into this work and having a different perspective and constantly having to code switch with academics. Being an Indigenous archaeologist is, I had one elder, I believe it was Cecil, describe it as standing in two canoes, but most of the time it feels like I'm in the water between two canoes trying to hold on to a Jimon and a steel canoe of modern construction. So to come into this work after that kind of a background and being on the other side, yeah, it's an awkward thing to say we inherit this work from our predecessors. And I'm fortunate enough that everyone previously involved was still around to continue with this work. Sort of a thing, because it is difficult. There are difficulties in the process, and when we come into these things with fresh eyes, we're not always aware of the previous things that happen in those conversations and feelings and background, sort of a thing. So I guess from this experience, it made me aware of those who have to follow after me, how to help them in this process. But I am incredibly honored to have honored that promise that my community, that Sioux tribe, that Cecil, that Colleen had made, and to fulfill that, and to bring this ancestor home, even if it was just at the end, and to have done that work. I don't think a lot of people realize it's an awkward thing with talking with institutions and scientists and everything, of the particular mindset and frame of reference and those conversations, to being part of this transition of hearing people acknowledging it as a human rights issue and not a scientific privileging issue, sort of an issue, thing. And just the conversations early in my career, on the archaeological side, and the heartlessness kind of how people talk, even aware of my indigeneity in the room, the attitudes 20 years ago, when I was an undergraduate, to today, hearing my colleagues, my archaeological anthropological colleagues, changing the way they talk about it, learning, and hopefully listening more when we point out things about how we present and talk about the ancestors. I myself have to be reminded of ways to talk, just because these aren't easy things to talk about and name and label. But to be coming into a point where more and more people recognize it as the human rights issue that it is. Cecil referred to our ancestors as hostages, and they very much so are in this situation of an ongoing settler colonialism and the issues that it brings between so many people trying to occupy and claim ownership over the same space, where people who are gone, who weren't even part of this initial conflict, are pulled into these sorts of situations, to be resting for how long before Europeans and other settlers came in and arrived. It's really difficult work, but I'm honored to be part of it, to continue fulfilling those promises that my community made, to find and bring home all of these ancestors. and to continue having those conversations with, institutions in the future. Every single time we do these, it's always a learning experience, and, how to communicate out, how to continue doing the work. I'm trying really hard not to cry right now. So I want to thank everyone for all the things I learned from all and each and every one of you, both in this process and those of you that I'll be working with in the future. So Chimigwich, and I believe I'm supposed to hand it off to David next.
Thank you, Marie. I really appreciate it. And if I could also try to do an introduction to David, although I don't know that I'll be great at it. But David Mees is not only a friend of mine and a friend of my community now, but David is the one who transported our ancestor from the museum all the way over here to Michigan, and also joined my community for the respectful and appropriate reburial ceremony of our ancestor. And also he's a cultural affairs officer with the U.S. Embassy in Berlin. My good friend, David, I'm going to turn it over to you. You have the floor now.
Thank you so much, Colleen, and thank you also, Cecil, for your incredibly kind words. And so good to see you again too, Marie. I thought it might be useful if I talked simply from the working level, based in an embassy abroad, and what I did to help in this case. And it did strike me that it's kind of a paradox that we are using this particular repatriation today, because in a way it was a horrible example of how it shouldn't work. It was a terribly long, protracted process, and obviously a very painful one for many of you. And yet, because it was that way, it is also an example of the power of persistence. And I'm reminded of a friend of mine in India who used to say, talking about the bureaucracy, the answer is always no, 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 until it is yes. So never give up. I've been here 3 years. When I arrived at the end of 2018, I didn't even know, in my briefings, nobody mentioned this case, that it had been dragging on. It was essentially no longer alive. And I felt incredibly fortunate that I got this message out of the blue about a year and a half later from Alison Davis, the person that Robin Leipold referred to as a moderator from the State Department. I had met Alison not long ago. I worked as a State Department liaison for a couple of years at the Smithsonian Institution. And Alison didn't only alert me to this case, but had written this wonderful, in-depth proposal, many pages long. And let me first say that as cultural affairs officer, I actually don't deal with these sorts of cases often. Once in Rome, I had dealt with repatriation of looted objects. But mostly we in cultural affairs for the State Department deal with educational exchanges, the Fulbright program and so forth. And we bring American speakers to Germany, and our job as in the practice of public diplomacy is to promote the dialogue between Americans and foreigners, in this case, Germans. So when I heard about this case, I asked my cultural assistant, do you know anything about this? And then she showed me the files, and there were tons of these files going back not long after 2010, maybe 2011, 12, something like that, when an American citizen visited the Karl May Museum and spotted your ancestors' remains, one of them having a specific label, and he took the initiative to approach the Sault Ste. Marie tribe of Chippewa Indians, and thank God he did. But then it became clear from reading the file that NAGPRA stops at the American borders, and the German government doesn't have a legal power to force a little private entity to give up part of its collection, and it had become a dead end, apparently. And so the museum simply had said, we are private. We are not like these big state collections, and we don't care about this new understanding among museum professionals that we should respect indigenous cultures in this way and that way. And in essence, they said, go away. And when this was revived, we had another piece of good fortune, which was that Ambassador Grinnell had gone back to the United States. And so our deputy chief of mission had become chargé d'affaires, so in charge of the embassy. And when she heard about this particular case, she said, wait a minute, I remember that. And she had been posted here earlier in her career, 2013, 15, something like that. And she remembered this, and she said, is this still going on? This has not been repatriated? That's outrageous. And then she visited the, well, first of all, we did what in our diplomatic world, we created a diplomatic note, which is an incredibly formal message on paper with the most flowery introduction and end paragraph that you can imagine, in which we officially, formally asked the German government again to help us push this matter along. And not long thereafter, we visited the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, the Director General of Culture and Communications, and my boss very humbly asked, so what should we do here? Do you have some advice for us? And that man said, go to the top, meet or intercede with the Minister President of Saxony, the state of Saxony. Unfortunately, we have a US consulate in Leipzig, which is in Saxony. And so the next time our Consul General, Tim Eidelnant, in Leipzig visited with the Minister President, he of course raised this issue. And the man didn't know about it, but said, how interesting. And he was receptive. And it was in the course of that year, and I don't know whether it had anything to do with the Minister President of the state, but the foundation that owns the Karl May Museum attracted their very first board member, who was, I'm told, a museum professional. I know this lady, Robin Leipold, and she often got on the phone with my colleagues in Leipzig and me in Berlin, and we talked about how can we make this happen. And she sure was a museum professional. She's a director of several collections in Saxony. What I don't know, what I meant to say, I don't know whether none of the board members had ever been a museum directory, but that's what I heard. And finally, about a year ago now, the museum or the board finally made the decision to, holding their noses, agree to hand over the your ancestor. And indeed, as Robin Leipold explained to us, they didn't want to. They were not going to hand it over to the tribe. They just wanted to use, the government as an easy way of saying, yeah, repatriation, we can believe in that, but we're not going to deal. We'll give it to you guys, and then you figure out what to do next. And then it took us months until April, finally, as Robin Leipold explained, before the handover took place, because we then had to hammer out the text of a declaration that met our legal standards and that they could live with. And boy, there were so many back and forths that even 2 weeks before the April 12th date, I wasn't sure that it was going to happen. So actually, this I'll be honest, this was one of the hardest things I ever did in my career. But I really was only doing my duty as a public servant, as your public servant. And diplomacy is all about pushing the ball forward, sometimes not very far, but you do what you can. And in typical bureaucratic fashion, we in the embassy, but also the German ministry, we both said, hey, friends in Sault Ste. Marie, we can put it in our diplomatic mail, what we call the pouch. And the Germans said, we can put it in our diplomatic pouch and send it to our embassy in Washington. And Cecil and the others just weren't comfortable with that. And so then I offered to put it in my carry-on the next time I was going to go to the States on vacation, because COVID prevented the tribe to come to Germany, as Robin mentioned. And I was happy to do that. I had lots of back and forths about the size of the cedar box, and I needed a box that could fit inside my carry-on. And I almost miscalculated, because there was also that cloth that I needed to wrap it in. Turned out all the stores were closed, so I couldn't buy a piece of red cloth, but it was gray cloth. And that almost made it too big to fit in, but I just fit in my carry-on. And last July, I had the great honor to hand over the ancestors' remains to my now friends in Sault Ste. Marie. So that was a treat for little David. I was just touched to be invited to the what I call the fire ceremony, is probably the wrong expression, when we sat around the fire and spoke from the heart, and then on to the interment, and then the spirit feast in the afternoon. And I got lots of wonderful little presents. Here, let me reach over. My pride and joy. And I was just so, I was pleased that I managed to persuade Marie to come to the ice cream parlor that I'd seen on that main street there in Portage Road, I think it's called, in Sault Ste. Marie. And I treated her to an ice cream cone. The one thing I bought for anyone there. So let me end with my pieces of advice for what it's worth for anybody else trying to initiate a repatriation request. Let's follow the advice of that Director General in the Foreign Ministry. Write to the top person in charge. If you know the working level, CC the working level, that's fine. But if you have to go online, in an embassy, the top person is an ambassador. Unless there is no ambassador, then it's the chargé d'affaires. They're always on the website. We have consulates in larger countries like Germany. There are 5 of them here. So then you write to the consul general, and it'll eventually get to the right person. Next point is you have every right to be angry about the situation, but my advice is in all your communications, pick a tone that is unassailable, that nobody can sort of dismiss this request as angry people, or they're out of their mind, or they're not very polite, or they're, just be completely unassailable in your language so that nobody can criticize it. And as a bureaucrat myself, be meticulous, prepare well, have your facts straight, and look at presentation. We get so much over our desks every day, or in our inboxes every day, that if something is poorly written and not proofread and all that, we tend to not take it as seriously. Communicate a lot in the process, but, and this is what I admired so much when I dealt with Cecil and Marie and Colleen in the beginning too, take your time, tell us that you're not ready to answer the question I've just posed, because you guys have to consult and think about it and speak to the elders. And that is fine, so long as we know what's going on and we're not hearing a deafening silence. Next point that I suggest, you may dismiss it, but if you have the feeling that you're making headway, keep it out of the media, because that's often taken as unwanted pressure by the people that you're trying to persuade to give something up. If you're not making headway, that might be the best thing to do. Be flexible. You're making a stink. Next point is, of course, be flexible. We always know we always have to be that. And finally, keep the faith. Use your public servants. We want to do the right thing. And so with that, thank you for your attention. I admire you all, and I have the pleasure to turn it over to my colleague in the Department of State, Ashley.
Gretch, David, thank you for those good words. I'm gonna pull Ashley up and also do my best to do a good introduction for Ashley. So it's my understanding Ashley was kind of made aware, or at least brought into this repatriation kind of towards the end, because Allison Davis was no longer able to work with us. Ashley is a citizen of the Choctaw Nation of Oklahoma and an Indigenous Affairs Officer with the Department of State Cultural Heritage Center. So Ashley, you have the floor now.
Thank you so much, Colleen. And oftentimes working for the federal government, we don't necessarily get the warmest of receptions. So I'm really heartened to hear of David's experience with your tribe. It makes me, it really makes me feel good that we had such a positive experience. And I want to give just a little bit of background how I came to work at the Cultural Heritage Center. Some of you may know me from previous repatriation conferences. I am usually with the Department of Interior, where I'm the Senior Advisor for International Affairs to the Assistant Secretary there. But I was able to come on board to the Cultural Heritage Center earlier this year in March on a long-term detail. So Allison, still working at the Cultural Heritage Center, I've just taken over the Indigenous Affairs portfolio from her for the time being. And I was able to sort of get my foot in the door at the very last moment with this repatriation, but learned quite a bit from talking with both David and Allison about their past experiences with the museum. And the Cultural Heritage Center's role in international repatriation is really one of assistance. We always encourage museums to work directly with tribes. We try to emphasize that tribes are the subject matter experts of their own cultural heritage, and they are the proper custodians of that cultural heritage. And so sometimes we get questions from museums as to whether or not a particular request is legitimate, and we always refer them back to the tribe. If the tribe is requesting a sacred object or a cultural object or ancestral remains, then they're the experts with regard to that heritage. And just to pick up a little bit on some of the things that David touched on with respect to reaching out to the foreign government, even though they may not be the custodians of, or the collections may not be in a federal museum. It's always helpful to find whether or not one of those private museums receives federal funding from the government. And oftentimes they do. And that is kind of a way for the federal government within that, whatever foreign country you're looking to put pressure on a private museum. And in this case, that it was the case with the Karl May, and so that added pressure from the government, I think also helped get the ball rolling. And it definitely helps to have an ambassador or a charge d'affaires who is able to and willing to advocate, like in this case, and also with the successful repatriation we had in 2020 from the National Museum in Finland. And then, I think that it's always helpful if you are not able to figure out who exactly, or you're not getting any traction with reaching out to an embassy or directly to a museum. The Cultural Heritage Center can be a good way to sort of get unstuck, right? So we have connections with embassies and our consulates within certain countries, but also we have museum connections through other work that we do that's separate from Indigenous affairs and international repatriation back to the U.S. So we can also help with sort of connecting other federal agencies. So oftentimes we work with the Department of Interior. And so Allison and I both have worked pretty closely on a few repatriations, and others within Interior have also worked with us. But in the Karl May case in 2015, the Deputy Assistant Secretary and Indian Affairs wrote directly to the Karl May and explained the legal status and nation-to-nation relationship that the U.S. government has with tribes. I think that's often another hurdle that we tend to face whenever we have these conversations with foreign governments or even independent museums or private museums, is sort of what is an Indian tribe and what is their status within the United States. And so having letters that come directly from the Department of Interior can often be helpful in explaining that nation-to-nation relationship. And then also the National NAGPRA program within the Department of Interior is very helpful in explaining how certain repatriations would occur domestically. And so Melanie O'Brien works frequently with the Cultural Heritage Center in communicating those types of situations to foreign museums. And that's also another way that we can sort of help get the ball rolling, explain how it's done domestically, and use this as a model for repatriations internationally. Another obstacle that I have encountered, not specifically with this repatriation, but sometimes museums want to have a say in how a sacred object or a cultural item or ancestral remains are handled once they come back to the United States. They want to say that a tribe should display something in a museum, for example. And any sort of official documentation, any sort of handover documentation that the museum wants to have, we try to make sure that any language that refers to how a tribe should handle an item or ancestral remains after they come back to the United States is not appropriate. For a museum does not have that kind of say over something that's been repatriated. And I think another thing in this specific instance that could have also been helpful is that, well, it is an international exchange program. So we had the International Visitor Leadership Program through the Department of State. And in 2018, several foreign museum leaders, including the then director at the Karl May, came over to the United States and met with tribes here and discussed the importance of international repatriation. And this is something that I personally would like to see happen again. I think it's important to have these sorts of exchanges. I think it makes it real for foreign museums to meet with tribes directly and visit tribal museums and talk with tribal historic preservation officers. And so, I think that carrying on that type of engagement is really important, and I hope to do more of that. But that's just a little bit about how the Cultural Heritage Center played a role in this repatriation and in how we assist with repatriations in general. But again, the federal government does not necessarily have to be involved. If it's a situation where it would not be helpful if we were involved, then there is no need to bring us into that. However, it can be helpful, and we want to make sure that we're doing that in a respectful way and are mindful of any sensitivities that a tribe may have with a particular repatriation. And then I want to just touch a little bit on press, because we always look to the tribes and follow their guidance on whether or not we should release any press on a particular repatriation. And so with the National Museum of Finland, we did put out some press, both DOI and state put out some press. But with this, we really did want to put the tribe's wishes first. And we're happy to follow whatever directions they have given us with regard to that. So I see we're running just a little bit late on time, so I'll stop there and we can open it up for questions, I guess.
Thank you so much, Ashley. We do have a couple of questions in the chat. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to pin everyone up here, if I can manage it. And I don't know if Robin is still with us or not, but if you are, Robin, we'd love to have you join us for the Q&A. First, let me say I'm so thankful for this panel and to see all of you and remember all of the people and all of the time that was spent to make the repatriation happen and to bring our ancestor home. And I know from the bottom of my heart, I know I want to thank you all, because it's true what Marie was saying, like the commitment that we made to that ancestor. When Cecil and I were in Germany together, I was unable to participate in ceremony with our ancestor for personal reasons, but Cecil was able to do ceremony with our ancestor, and I was praying real hard. Downstairs, and I kept saying, like, I won't give up. I kept saying that. I promise. I promise. I promise. And then I realized after 8 years of this going on that maybe I made a promise that I couldn't keep. And then to see it come full circle, and then to realize that I was, personally and on behalf of my community and our people, like able to have that promise come full circle, and I didn't feel like it was no longer something that I was concerned that I couldn't keep, because then I thought to myself, maybe I shouldn't have made that promise. But you know what? I think that's important. We do make those promises to our ancestors that we're coming back for them. We won't forget them. We won't leave them. And as Cecil said, we won't stop either. And I think we can all agree that definitely the Association on American Indian Affairs has launched, the Everything Back movement, and we are coming for everything that makes us who we are, including our ancestors, and we won't stop. So I just wanted to say that before we move to the Q&A. We do have 2 questions there. If anyone else has a question, please put it there, and what I'll do is I'll pull it up on screen, and then whoever wants to answer or is able to answer it, just unmute yourself and go ahead. So I'm not even sure if this is a question, but let's dive in. Any German lawyers out there? I doubt if the German law under which the Karl May is incorporated or licensed permits organizations under the relevant law to act in contravention of the religious and or property rights of the collected. Perhaps, David, you might be the only one here that might know a little bit about German law in this regard.
Actually, I studied art and I know nothing about law, but I was told when I got into this that under German law, well, I read in the file that the German Ministry of Foreign Affairs communicated, like this was 5 years ago when the dead end was reached, that they couldn't do anything because their lawyers had determined that there's no way to force a private entity, to return human remains. Oddly enough, that just doesn't exist yet. They don't have anything like NAGPRA. But there, instead, there's this consensus that has built, that you saw so beautifully expressed by the museum people in the previous session in Germany and Switzerland and Sweden. There is this willingness to start returning things, but for private entities, apparently the law stops there.
Thank you, David. I appreciate that. And unfortunately, since Robin couldn't stay, we don't have his perspective. But does anyone else want to answer that question before we move on?
I'd just like to say, from my understanding, there are German Museum Association recommendations, and the Karl May Museum had its own recommendations that do in some part follow those national recommendations. So I don't know if that doesn't qualify as sort of anything legally binding, but it is something that is, on a national scale that museums are theoretically supposed to follow.
Thank you, Ashley. And if my memory serves me well, there are recommendations for care and treatment and for repatriation. But again, those are just recommendations. And I think, Cecil, we cited those in a lot of our correspondence, and it didn't seem to help. So whether or not we know about them, they didn't really help anyway. Here's another question that also would probably be directed to Robin if he was still with us. But I also think that you all could have a good perspective on this. Why is the survival of the museum that lives off the lifeblood of Indigenous peoples more important than those peoples? Now, this is something we see with a lot of institutions. So not just the Karl May Museum. Maybe, Cecil, did you want to say something about that?
Sure. I guess I would say the survival of those museums is not important. to us as a tribe. What is important is that there is respect with one another. The way we treat one another, hopefully, is sincere. And again, we go back to that idea of being patient and doing whatever it takes to get what we need to do done. And so it's, to me, it's not important. If that makes sense.
I think that is a really good question because museums are complicit in colonialism and encouraging it, enforcing it, and maintaining that colonial structure. I mean, I made my dissertation advisor cry when I said that if anthropology can't stop being complicit in colonialism, maybe we should just stop being anthropologists. It's privileging, you know, we privilege these institutions, we privilege this system, and if museums have to go to be part of eliminating colonialism, then they have to go.
Thank you, Cecil and Marie. Did you want to say something, Ashley?
I did. You know, I'm not a museum professional. I'm not an anthropologist. I am trained as an attorney, unfortunately. But in working in this field, I think it's possible for the idea of museums to evolve over time. And, you know, one of the things that we try to advocate for is the collection of contemporary art and craft work. And then also encouraging exchanges. You know, partnerships with tribal museums. If a foreign museum is very interested in having an exhibition of Native American cultural heritage, to partner with tribes or tribal museums to bring that cultural heritage to, you know, the appropriate cultural heritage to the foreign country.
Thank you, Ashley. I appreciate that. I've definitely seen some really good decolonization efforts from certain institutions and institutions that were grossly non-compliant for a very long time, almost turned themselves around and are now, you know, actively working with Indigenous people regarding the care and treatment of collections and the repatriation process. And so I say all that to say, I think that there is a part of me that really agrees with Cecil. We don't care. And then there's the other part of me that really thinks there's an opportunity for collaboration and some decolonization and really good collaboration with Indigenous people. So I just want to say that we don't have another question. So let me ask a question because we've got 6 minutes left and I can talk. I think you all know that by now. I wanted to circle back on Cecil, maybe this question's for you. I really wanted to draw a little bit more on, like, you know, because in Robin's, you know, presentation earlier, he really, you know, he felt like it was a real struggle on the museum end to come to these decisions and to this burden he was facing. And I know on our end, we certainly had a language barrier, and there was a major time difference. And so could we even schedule meetings? And then the intent was, you know, the intent from both sides was not communicated well. And we were, there was a turnover with different directors at the museum, as with staff at the tribe. I mean, there was a lot of barriers we were facing, but the ultimate barrier was that the burden was placed on the tribe. It was our responsibility to prove that ancestor was Ojibwe, and that we were able, if it was in the US and NAGPRA applied, that our tribe would have been perfectly able to repatriate that ancestor. And all of the legwork that we did to come up with letters of support, and all of the things that we did in the background, I really wanted to draw some of that out from you, maybe Cecil, to really hone in on, like, what did that process look like from our end as the tribe who's working on this, because we didn't have time to even process the emotional burden, because we were too busy trying to get letters of support, trying to get experts to do research, trying to do research ourselves. I mean, we really committed to this and to that ancestor. And so I just wondered if maybe you could speak to that a little bit.
I'll try. I guess when a museum comes across, so strongly against repatriation or against sincere dialogue, it's kind of reminds me of back when NAGPRA was first passed and how the museums here acted, and how some of that hierarchy of those institutions, the feeling I got, it's like, who do you think you are to tell us what to do? That's kind of a feeling that is, fortunately, way less prevalent today in the U.S. There has been a lot of good conversations, good efforts, good outcomes. I can see the change in sentiment by today's archaeologists, anthropologists, and Robin kind of mentioned this. I found it interesting when he said that about, he didn't really say it completely, but I think what he was trying to say is when the old guys are gone, and so I kind of had that same feeling many times. There are certain ones that we call old school in their thought, and again, who do you think you are, and so we have waited till some of them have been gone, and then we successfully repatriated, plain and simple. One person at the top of a museum can influence everyone else, and again, we have to try to be patient, try to treat them with respect, to use, I guess, the ethical behavior that they proclaim through different avenues of what they have to say. But, kind of behind the scenes, I always felt like there was just this indignation of, who are you to tell me what to do, and so kind of let that go, had to let that go. And again, being patient and trying to use diplomacy to successfully repatriate, whether it is ancestral remains and or sacred objects, items of cultural patrimony. And for us in our discussions, we've always talked about the importance of ancestral remains and paying attention to that first. And once we get all ancestral remains back from all over this world, then we can move on to the sacred objects and items of cultural patrimony, because they are important, but not as important as our ancestors. And the idea of the idea of being laid to rest without having fears of being disturbed, of being desecrated, of being taken from your resting place to wherever. There's just so much to try to understand from their perspective, and for them to try to understand our perspective, and again, lost in translation, they thought we were saying things different. We thought they were saying things different. And so that communication is really difficult. And but if you're sincere and you're approaching things with a clean mind and a good heart, things will happen.
Miigwech, for those good words, Cecil, and what a good way to kind of close this out.
Everything